Canada has been a nation of immigrants since its founding. As such, people here have connections, often deep and ongoing ones, with the lands of their birth or their ancestors. That's simple enough. But as explosive allegations about foreign interference recently made clear, the nature of those ties can suddenly come into question, sometimes in unexpected ways. With us now to reflect on some of that complexity, let's welcome, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Joanna Chu, national correspondent at the Toronto Star and the author of China Unbound. In Vaughan, Ontario, Kamari Maxine Clark, interim director at the University of Toronto's Centre for Diaspora and Transnational Studies. And here in our studio, Anna Sternsis, director of the Anne Tannenbaum Centre for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. Anna, it's good to see you again. And to our friends Joanna and Kamari and Points Beyond, we're glad you could join us for this discussion as well. Joanna, to you first. The feds have just begun this public consultation on setting up a foreign influence registry. Do we assume this is happening as a direct response to the election interference from China?
Yeah, it appears to be a pretty direct response to the huge, national public backlash against some of the media reports that are based on CSIS spy documents that are primarily focused on efforts of the Chinese state and trying to influence Canadian society, and particularly elections, the last couple of elections. Although CSIS also always stresses that China is not their primary focus, not their main focus, that other countries, including Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, are also involved in foreign influence, which, many of us are already aware of. But it bears repeating that it's not just a China issue, but the latest controversies and the latest leaks from CSIS that Global and Global Mail reported are focused on China.
No, very fair point. And I don't expect you, obviously, to be able to speak for the entire Chinese diaspora, but I know you are plugged into that. So perhaps you could share what kinds of reactions you're hearing from the Chinese diaspora to this development.
Yeah, it's a very mixed reaction, as you can imagine. But even people who are very in favor and actually have been warning about Beijing's activities in Canada for decades, which I wrote about a couple of weeks ago with the Star. This has been happening for decades, and I saw records of Chinese Canadians testifying to Parliament as early as 2006, and then subsequently doing so many times a year, trying to get the government to do something about it. But even among that group, there are mixed emotions right now. Because while people are happy that we are having this conversation finally, a lot of people are upset and frustrated that it's kind of went and turned into a pretty partisan and some would say ugly direction of rhetoric where there's a lot of finger pointing. Just going on Twitter, I see that people are posting photos or coming up with anecdotes saying this person, I think, met with the Chinese consulate back then. But we have to remember that meeting or being in the same room as a Chinese consulate or a Chinese official doesn't mean you're an agent of the Chinese state. It just means you're in the same room, you're in the same event. So we're missing some cultural context and also some context of how China operates here in Canada, which is really trying to ingratiate itself with the communities, including Chinese Canadian communities, for decades, trying to pose itself and position itself as a benevolent kind of motherland that will support you even when you're an immigrant and become a citizen here in Canada. So I'm actually doing a piece where I actually looked through the legal definitions of things like foreign influence and agent and things like that. And I realized that part of the problem is that Canada lacks many coherent legal definitions of the words we're using right now, including foreign influence. The RCMP and CSIS operate with two different definitions. The RCMP says it has to be something illegal, which is tricky because in Canada we don't actually have foreign interference laws, and CSIS has its own set of requirements.
Interesting. Kamari, let me get you in and get your sense of at what point do you think diaspora politics become vehicles for foreign interference, and you can define that however you like.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. Well, of course, diaspora politics are vehicles for many things. Diasporic flows are complex. Borders are porous. and the relationship between influence and interference are also complex. So yes, indeed, people, information, with new forms of mediated technologies, there are many platforms through which people communicate. And diasporas, the migration of people from place to place, the circulation of information, of ideas, of convictions, of political agendas, all are part of the diasporic circulation and diasporic conception. So yes, indeed, they are key domains for these forms of circulation.
Anna, your research involves Jewish studies as well as the intersection with the Russian diaspora.
Right.
How has, let's hit this right on the head, how has the Russian invasion of Ukraine affected those diaspora narratives in your experience?
Well, for once, it increased the number of people in those diasporas because Ukrainians are fleeing Ukraine, over 6 million right now, but also Russians are fleeing Russia, and for different reasons. Ukrainians are fleeing violence. Russians are fleeing possible sanctions, possible draft in the army, and general in protesting the war. So what happened with the Jews within those refugees. So we see about 20,000 Jews fleeing Ukraine, and some of them go to Israel. The majority of them go to other places like Germany and Austria. Some are trying to get to Canada. And for Russian Jews, the world is a little bit more closed. So some of them go to Kazakhstan and Armenia and Georgia, and some to Israel. And the way that the dynamic, the politics, the attitudes to Russian invasion of Ukraine transpires to diasporic community really matters on where people came from. A lot of Russian-speaking Jews in Canada, for example, come from Ukraine. And they are dealing with their family members, with their communities being destroyed right now. A lot of Russian people and Russian Jews do feel extremely devastated by what happened and involved in rescue effort or resettlement effort to these for these refugees. So what we're seeing right now is actually one of those transformative points of Russian-speaking Jewish diaspora. And it will be known as before and after, like we had before World War II, after World War II. Now the way that this Russian-speaking Jewish community will evolve also will get Ukrainian-speaking Jewish community. It will be known as before and after.
And a quick follow-up, you said 20,000 Jews from Ukraine had left. Any idea how many Russian Jews have left Russia?
So it's hard to count. Some numbers I heard were about 14 to 17,000 of them settled in Israel, and we know that because they count in Israel. But we have no idea how many went to Georgia, Armenia, or even places like in Western Europe or North America, because if people had visas, they could go everywhere else, and the religion or ethnicity were not registered. So we don't know.
Gotcha. Kamari, I don't have to tell anybody who watches the news in this country that immigration is the main driver of Canada's population and labor force going back a long time. If I look back at the years 2016 to 2021 alone, we got 1.3 million immigrants moving to Canada and settling here. We are a nation of immigrants, overwhelmingly. In what ways do diasporas engage and connect with their homelands?
Yeah, it's an important question to document in many ways, because these diasporic circulations have an influence on everyday politics, both on the federal, provincial, local level, and also fundamentally influence homeland, hometown politics in the places of origin. So for example, if you think about the 2015 Nigerian elections, or even the current elections, the tremendous role of diasporic actors, Nigerians and Nigerian scholars and the elite and policymakers lobbying and ensuring that international organizations, that local organizations ensure that there actually are fair and free elections, that particular issues are on the agenda, that the monetary possibilities are viable because people are giving through remittances. So found ways that the Nigerian diaspora, for example, has influenced the electoral politics there. We see the same in the Caribbean Rim. The significant role, 10% of the GDP is remittance funding, oftentimes that also goes to support political parties. And one of the most classic examples, of course, is around South Africa and anti-apartheid from the late 80s into the early 90s, where diasporic South Africans, as well as people of the African diaspora and well beyond, participated in the implementation of sanctions and other forms of social mobilization to ensure that the particular regime, a racist regime in South Africa, toppled and new forms of democratic politics were put in place. And there's so many examples in the African diaspora: the establishment of foreign ministries, the enabling of dual citizenship, the enabling of the possibility for voting rights for those who live abroad, and the honing of these expat relationships certainly are key. So there are ways that these diasporic politics are being woven into the political and legal infrastructure to enable these formations to happen. There are ways that political convictions, like in the case of South Africa, which is a historic case, but certainly an important case in the African diaspora, there are ways that political convictions and political positions have been mobilized to really transform and produce democratic systems in the case of South Africa. And certainly we see that in many, many African countries, from Ethiopia to Senegal to Cote d'Ivoire, etc. The place of provisions for these possibilities are tremendous.
And Joanna, let's bring it really to today's headlines here. How does the issue of homeland connection become problematic or contentious when somebody is running for office?
I think some of the conversations we're having now are kind of affected by the fact that Ottawa, as a political bubble, is quite elite, and perhaps the makeup of the city of Ottawa, demographics-wise, does not reflect some of the diversity that are in other parts of Canada, such as Vancouver and Toronto. So I think for a long time, it's fair to say that a lot of immigrant groups, people of color, feel like they're interest groups that politicians, mostly based in Ottawa or wherever their offices are, try to engage only right before elections. And then they're doing things in a kind of awkward fashion and asking questions like, what do Chinese Canadian voters want? What do they care about? And not grasping the diversity and the complexity and the unique threats and dangers of being a diaspora Canadian. So I can speak in the context of China. Beijing, how it views international Chinese is that they reject the foreignness of people who have sometimes lived in Canada and other places for centuries, for generations, who have never stepped foot in China. I myself, living in China as a journalist for French media, I was repeatedly denied that identity. I was always treated as, well, you're originally from Hong Kong, not even Hong Kong, you're just Chinese. And you'd be treated as such. And there's been Chinese Canadians, Chinese Australians who are in jail right now in China because they're denied their foreignness. Canadian consulates have trouble reaching them because, according to Chinese law, basically you're only Chinese if you have any kind of connection to China. Even if you weren't born in China, you're kind of the legal system in China, you would imagine, and it isn't very logical. So people in Canada are dealing with this context where their Canadianness is not necessarily perfection for them, even living in Canada. So in terms of foreign influence, the consulates here have, again, long had these both kind of carrot and stick approaches of trying to engage with the population of Chinese Canadians, both carrots in that we will support your businesses, we'll support your families here, we'll make, you're invited to these cultural events, these New Year's celebrations. And then the sticks, these are directed at people in Canada. Many of them are critical of the Chinese government because they chose to leave China, or their parents or grandparents did, because of political persecution. So naturally, many of them are outspoken and are, multilingual, perfectly fluent in English or French, and are trying to raise awareness about issues in China. And that's what Beijing doesn't want. So it uses a stick approach to try to silence people. So a lot of foreign influence in Canada is actually, in a way, passive because foreign states have successfully silenced diasporas. We don't see it in action because we don't hear from people anymore. A common way to silence them is to threaten their family and friends or their businesses back home in China, or not, I should say home, that's kind of repeating a kind of Beijing trope. But back in China, if you still have any family or friendship connections, or your business has any ties with China, that's leverage for Beijing to use. And that's leverage that has been used and reportedly used against people who aren't of Chinese descent. In Australia, journalist John Garneau, who was very influential in helping Australia craft its foreign interference laws, his friend, Chinese writer friend of his, was used as leverage to try to silence his activities as an Australian. So it's a playbook that is expanding and could affect any Canadian with any ties to China.
Anna, let me ask you about those tens of thousands of Ukrainian Jews or Russian Jews who are now going to new countries, and what kind of democratic engagement they can look forward to, either in their new countries with their new situations, or from their former countries who may want to keep an eye on what's going on.
The circumstances are different for Russian Jews and for Ukrainian Jews. And one thing I do want to say is that this is, I think, one of the first times in modern Jewish history when being Jewish was actually not a factor of whether or not people left the old country. You know what I mean? The Jews are not being targeted or persecuted as Jews, either in Russia or in Ukraine, but they are experiencing different challenges as they leave. So, for example, for Russian citizens, one of the major motivation of people who are leaving is for men to avoid the draft in the army because they don't want to serve. So families with boys between the age of 17 and up, they're much more likely to leave than, for example, those families who have daughters or don't have people eligible for that draft. So what are they going to do? They're going to try to go to a country that will let them in, and there's a sense of urgency. And if they're Jews, they actually have Israel available to them. And there's a whole big discussion of whether or not it's an attractive destination. For example, majority of Ukrainian Jews chose not to go to Israel because they perceive it as especially difficult. They worry about adaptation, and they prefer to go to countries that have better social packages. And
what does that mean, better social packages?
Oh, better unemployment packages, better support for refugees, also easier time to find work. For example, Canada introduced that Kuwait legislation that allows Ukrainian refugees to start working right away and have full rights here for 3 years. Well, that's very attractive compared to some other places where they don't have those rights. Germany introduced this kind of legislation. So there's a lot of choices for them. And interestingly, the presence of a strong diaspora does not seem to be a factor. It does not seem to be a factor. However, having said that, where it is a factor is on personal connections. So in other words, what we know from refugee studies, that more cultural capital people have, further they can go. And by cultural capital, I mean if they have family somewhere else, if they speak a foreign language, if they have a transferable skill profession that they can apply somewhere else, or if they have a family member living somewhere else, they're much more likely to go there. So people with less cultural capital can go as far as, neighboring village or neighboring town, 10, 15 kilometers away. And people with more opportunities and also actual capital like bank accounts and funds go further. So what we see happening is that Russians who live in Russia are usually people who work remotely, who have access to foreign income, who speak foreign languages. They're the most privileged of all this group of refugees. So they choose to go, they try to go somewhere where the opportunities will continue. And Ukrainian refugees they have to leave fast because they're actually fleeing violence, but where they settle matters which country is more welcoming to them. And I think what will also happen, and we're seeing it already, we'll have to start having a discussion about, who are these new refugees? What is this new diaspora? Comparing to Jews, for example, who left persecution or anti-Semitic policies in the 70s compared to Russian Jews who leave Moscow, for example, today and complain in Israel that there's not enough pumpkin spice latte. There's been a big discussion on the internet. They created a Facebook group called Pumpkin Spice Latte, which has 100,000 members, discussing how you can't get luxuries, like that in Israel. So, so this is a very different discussion compared to the old country discussion of how do I find a job? How do I learn language quickly? How do I fit in? So the complexity of diaspora will stay, and it will definitely inform the politics as well. How they retain connection with Ukraine and with Russia, and how do they deal with all these Russian-speaking people here coming from Ukraine? That's a whole another debate. Even I think the role of and also diasporas are no longer one way. So when the war is over, hopefully sooner than later, a lot of people will return, and a lot of people will return to Russia as well. So it will be very interesting to see what will happen once all these people who had experience living abroad are coming back, and what kind of a relationship they will retain with the diaspora.
Absolutely. Kamari, let me ask you about this Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at U of T that you are the leader of at the moment. Why do you think it's important to understand the circulation of culture and politics as it relates to our geopolitical struggles today?
Sure. Well, states are entities of people. And in part, what we need to do is understand how entities of people negotiate, navigate. What are the complexities? What are the indirect and direct ways that decisions are made? What are the cultural forms that take shape? How do we avoid simply putting everyone in a box and generalizing? And what are the ways that we can teach students, that we can teach policymakers, politicians to think complexly about the social problems in our world? And so part of what we do at the University of Toronto, at the center, is to teach courses that really allow us to understand some of the most difficult issues of our time, and to understand them in relation to particular toolkits, in relation to theories of the global, of the transnational, to think about the ways that history informs contemporary relations and contemporary debates, and to apply in many ways a new architecture, a new conceptual architecture to thinking about contemporary complexities in relation to China, in relation to Russia, in different parts of the African diaspora, in the Caribbean and elsewhere. What are the contexts around which we need to think about refugees? What people are mobile and who isn't as mobile? What are the ways that Canadian foreign policy in fact discriminates against particular kinds of people coming from particular regions in the world with particular passports? We teach and really try to emphasize the importance of understanding inequality, including inequality in policymaking. And so there are many diverse issues that are of a geopolitical nature that have to do with deep historical issues, deep political issues, the histories of colonialism, the histories of contemporary state formation, the nature of civil wars, and how those wars have an impact on the refugee problems that we have. And so in many ways, it really is about the assemblage of these various components and complexities of our world, and teaching students, teaching colleagues to really put in place conceptualizations that allow us to make sense of those complexities.
Joanna, let me set up my next question for you by reading a snippet of an op-ed that was in the Globe and Mail recently. Imen Lau published this, and it's called "To Really Tackle Beijing's Interference, Canada Must Engage with the Chinese Diaspora." And here's the excerpt. Canada's response continues to miss opportunities to engage with the Chinese diaspora and dissident communities who have long been sounding the alarm on the Chinese Communist Party's meddling in our democracy. The status quo represents a silencing on two fronts. While the Chinese diaspora faces increasing anti-Asian sentiment and marginalization in Canada, the baggage of another home has followed them across oceans. Okay, can I just get you to react to that?
Yeah, I really agree with Iman. It's not a controversial take. It's pretty much a factual description of what has been going on for a long time. We see that in panels on TV talking about the CSIS leaks about China for over a month. A Chinese person did not appear on some of the major networks, um, and it's as if it's okay and mainstream to not even notice that Chinese Canadian experts and voices aren't speaking at all and being part of the conversation. When these are exactly the voices I think we need to hear from, because people in the communities tend to have that nuance and context that people say are sometimes missing in conversations. So it's definitely, like the panelists have said today, a structural issue in Canada of marginalization of diaspora voices. And it shows that it's not just a issue of being politically correct or polite. It's actually a pretty crucial matter of policymaking that we have people who know what they're talking about helping to contribute to policymaking and public awareness and understanding of these issues. As a journalist, most of my sources on these issues on China are clearly people of Chinese descent or people who have worked and lived in China. That kind of experience in China, as complex a place as it is very crucial. And Canada lacks a lot of the structural pathways for students and people in government to gain this knowledge independently. So Chinese Canadians are a huge resource that are being untapped right now and feeling ignored, and some people feeling like the risk of speaking out isn't worth it because, like Iman wrote, they risk kind of the stereotyping and anti-Asian racism. Personally, if I try to add some nuance to the conversation, I've been called a CCP, pro-China shill, China hugger, spy, agent, like all of these words thrown out at me. And on the other side, if you are critical and you're actually working with the Canadian government, trying to help come up with solutions or just passing on information from your communities, there's also the real threat of surveillance and intimidation, and real concrete actions from the Chinese state trying to silence you. So the people that we do hear from publicly, you have to appreciate that they're actually taking a great risk in doing so.
Right. We're down to about a minute left, Anna. I wonder if I can ask you, given that this country is set to welcome 500,000 new immigrants per year over the next, few years, how do you think all of the issues that we've been talking about today need to evolve in order to deal with that new reality?
Well, I think everyone should study diaspora studies, right, Kamari?
Little plug for your department there,
A little plug for our center. No, because I think diasporas and immigrants and refugee experience are becoming central Canadian experience. Mm-hmm. Every story you covered right now is history of Canada. And I think sooner the society will understand that actually studying diasporic individuals, our students at the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies are mostly first and second generation Canadian. They wanted to know what is their story, what is their identity, what is their place in Canada. That's why they take our classes. And I think that soon it should be encouraged, and I'm hoping that because we turned our face to new Canadians and older Canadians with their diasporic roots, we will have a better society, healthier society where people understand each other, celebrate differences, and and don't suspect each other with double alliances and all this kind of stuff that was hurting and poisoning lives of a lot of people. So I'm hopeful that more immigrants come. More seriously, we'll take the field of diaspora studies and diasporas itself, and then we'll build a better society.
Fabulous.
Optimistic now.
Very optimistic and not a bad place to leave it. Mr. Director, can I get a 3-shot, please, so I can thank all of our guests? There's Joanna Chu in the middle, coming to us from the Toronto Star in Vancouver. Anna Sternsis on the left-hand side of the screen from the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at U of T. And Kamari Maxine Clark, Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies, U of T, on the right-hand side of the screen. Thanks to you three for coming on to TVO tonight and explaining this all so well. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.